Wilfred Reilly, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Glad to be on the show.
You've got a new book,
Boom.
and then you've got two others, and there are so many things for us to go through in them that I'm excited to dig in. But before I do, just describe briefly kind of what's your current job. So you're an academic. You're at Kentucky State University, correct? So what do you do as a professor?
Yeah, I'm a pretty typical academic professor. I teach at one of the American state universities, what's called a land-grant university. So the Kentucky State would be like Michigan State to Michigan, except a little smaller. It's the second.
I went to Penn State.
I'm sorry?
I went to Penn State. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty typical job. I mean, the one thing that makes Kentucky State interesting is that the second Kentucky State U is a historically black college. So this goes back to 1886. The Kentucky legislature wanted to apportion funds for another good-sized state school, but they also wanted a black school. And as I recall, they were asked whether they would fund two colleges, and they basically said, hell no. This isn't a wealthy state, so you're getting this one. Mostly black guys. And that has been a big part of the Kentucky State legacy since. But I mean, as a professor, I teach what's called 4 and 4. Generally, I teach a series of classes each semester. So I teach, American government, constitutional law, the presidency, congressional praxis, that kind of thing. And I mean, you're expected to write, every state U prof is. I've written 4 books so far, which I expect we'll discuss. I've written a bunch of stuff this year. I'm a columnist for National Review, so I have something like 60 publications. But I mean, I've written 3 sort of standard, peer-reviewed, good journal academic articles, or I've been on them. Corey Clark wrote a famous review of academic censorship for PNAS that's been cited a lot. I'm one of the people that was a part of that paper. Bob Moranto, myself, and Pat Wolf wrote, this is actually probably my favorite, a review of the impact of Black Lives Matter on crime, and also an analysis of which police departments actually reduce rates of officer-involved shootings. And that's an interesting paper because a lot of cops have read it. I don't get the feeling that any activists have at all.
Let's dig into that. So what was lay that paper out, because I mean, this gets into, it gets into a lot of things you talk about around statistics and popular narratives around race and crime. And so this seems like a great place to start.
Yeah, well, that's Bob Moranto, Robert Moranto, Pat Wolf at the University of Arkansas, and I were interested in, first of all, a lot of the Black Lives Matter research, I'm speaking for me, not my more gentlemanly co-authors, but seemed to just be bullshit. Like, if you looked at it, there was nothing about, like, did Black Lives Matter reduce police shootings? There was one paper, maybe. There was a lot of stuff like Black Lives Matter and its impact on Ben & Jerry's flavorings of ice cream. And by the way, this type of stuff is very, very common. There is a human genetic database that was recently put together by, I believe, the UK. And one of their restrictions is that you can't use it to test, as I recall, whether there are intelligence gaps between racial groups, whether there are athleticism gaps between racial groups, a couple of other things like that. And so people are doing things like looking at the face shape of different ethnic groups. And to me, it's just a matter of time until someone bootlegs the whole thing and people start looking at interesting questions. But the BLM literature was very much along the same lines. And we were interested in a couple of things. Like, one, what was the effect on crime? And 2, what do police departments do? This was the focus of the paper, to actually reduce both crime and officer-involved shootings. And we actually found that there are a lot of things that a department can do to reduce violent interactions with the public while still keeping crime low. The biggest one is taking a few rogue cops off the street. Like, we now know that
Bad apples.
Yeah, we now know the George Floyd case was more complicated than it was presented for years as being, but the officer involved in that case had something like 4 previous outstanding complaints. One of them wasn't resolved. I mean, that case doesn't occur if you have a New York or Chicago style system where you don't even have to make the guy stop being a cop because of union seniority. You're just the guy that's washing badges or, checking cars into the impound or whatever. I mean, all those jobs, you're handing over suspect files in the dungeon of the police department. And if you do that well for 2 years, then you get back on the street. I mean, it was that simple in many cases. Train cops in how to use physical violence below the level of the gun was one. There's a paper by a cop called Teach Cops to Roll that just talks about the impact of martial arts. The thing is, that's incredibly obviously useful, but you have to fund it. There are potential injuries to officers, that kind of thing. But just on and on and on. I mean, we talked about different things you can do. Like, for example, if you draw a gun rather than fire a gun, you could double the length of paperwork associated with that, but not the use of a non-lethal weapon. Like, this is just actual social science. Like, we looked at what worked in departments like the NYPD, which had a very good record. People don't know this, but, well, I'm assuming many people do. But New York, at one point, was responsible for something like 20% perhaps of the murders in the United States. There were years when New York City had 2,100 or 2,500 murders. Even Chicago, I mean, we rarely got up to the 1,000 murder threshold, the second city.
Yeah, you're talking about like probably the 70s and 80s, I would think.
Yes. Yeah, the sort of New Jack City era and the period immediately before that. Yeah, that's exactly correct. And New York City under Giuliani, Bratton, for that matter, David Dinkins, cracked down on crime. There are things like point of sale and point of use restrictions on guns, extremely tough policing. Even liberal mayors like Eric Adams often tend to be former cops. So New York now averages about 400 murders a year. So we looked at what they did, and we found that a lot of it was very empirical, very implementable. The worst cities in our study were almost all kind of crooked regional capitals. So you're talking about like Little Rock, Memphis, Jackson, Mississippi. Police departments were often a mix of black and rural white dudes. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but like there wasn't a culture of police discipline. The idea was, well, these scumbags have it coming to them. I'm not indicting any of those cities, but I've heard officers comment on the paper and say that, and that's where somewhat expected places like Albuquerque, but that's where you would have very high rates of OIS, officer-involved shootings. You also have high rates of crime in those places, but you don't have a low rate of crime in New York. So the question is, how can you reduce that? The second point of the paper is a lot simpler. What happened to crime under Black Lives Matter? It doubled. I mean, if you want to look at homicide, the black homicide rate went from about 16 or 17 per 100,000. Now that's age adjusted, but in 2012 to 33 per 100,000 10 years later. I mean, that's it. There was a massive increase in crime concentrated among African Americans. Anyone who tries to deny that is essentially just lying.
When you say Black Lives Matter, what exactly are you talking about? And because there's the organization itself, there's the events after George Floyd's death in 2020, but then there's the organization. I think starts in 2015 after Ferguson. So when you say Black Lives Matter's impact on crime and police, what's the time frame and what's the mechanism there? Like, is it just the message? Is it the actual organization doing things in specific places with specific people? Like, unpack that for me.
What I'm referring to, I guess, is the post-Trayvon Martin movement headed by Patrisse Cullors and the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. So very often when we talk about things, like when I say, I was an activist, and people ask, what does that mean? Do you have a sign? Were you out there on the street? It's like, no, I worked at the lower management level for a group called the Human Rights Campaign, which was retained by another group that we can call the People's Project. And I made an average of $27.58 per hour as a street canvasser who most people thought was a volunteer. Like, that's what an activist is. There are massive organizations that employ these guys for good and ill. Mostly they're very well-intentioned young folks, by the way. But I mean, it's the same thing with BLM. We're talking about a very specific movement, which had a pretty specific goal, which was reducing police stop and arrest rates. So, I mean, that's where you see things like the op-ed. I don't think this was a full editorial, but yes, we mean literally defund the police, running on the back page of the New York Times. So, I mean, during this period, which I would date back, first use of the hashtag is 2013, just after Trayvon Martin was killed. By the way, in a mutually provoked fight with a Hispanic guy. I mean, none of these stories ever turned out to be true. Like, you wish both men were with us today, but this is two guys getting into a fight. One of the guys is losing the fight. He's getting his head slammed against the pavement. He's got a pistol on him. He discharges one shot, probably justifiably. Like, there was no civil rights element to that case at all. That was the beginning of all this. Then we led to Michael Brown. Michael Brown, hands up, don't shoot. Again, we now know that this guy attacked a police officer, Darren Wilson. Michael Brown's DNA was found on the slide and trigger guard of Darren Wilson's gun. The Barack Obama Justice Department refused to indict Darren Wilson. This doesn't mean that I, as a former working class kid, support any level of police abuse. It's just all these narratives were lies. And they were promoted by pretty specific organizations. And you can track down, as I and others have done. This was a feature in Spiked UK that I wrote that was pretty heavily edited that people contributed to. But I mean, you can track down who these organizations were, how much money they took in, how much money they gave out. And the end goal was we need to reduce or remove policing in the USA. So during that period, I mean, if you have an organization that says we need to stop American policing, and during that period, police stops drop 31% and the murder rate surges, I mean, the connection there is not especially difficult to draw. And I mean, it's a problematic one. But one last thing about BLM, by the way, that I don't think most black guys or like basketball playing white allies from the big cities or whatever understand, college kids, is that BLM was not a movement focused on helping the hood if you follow the money. In fact, neighborhood activists like Hawk Newsom, who's a cool guy, have criticized Black Lives Matter very extensively for this. And in the Spiked piece, we were able to pull up where they had sent money. And it was almost entirely like far left gay rights, anti-parenting organizations. Like just wild business, like the Transgender Travel Fund got 6 to 7 figures. And I guarantee you this is true. If you look up Wilfred Reilly BLM funding, you'll find not only I, but the people I'm citing. You'll find tax documents. One of them was for the Gworls, GWORLS, which is, again, a trans and sex worker performance project, if I recall correctly. Just on and on and on. Like, none of them, it wasn't like the Abyssinian Baptist Church of Harlem. I'll tell you that. Like, it was a very specific listing of organizations. So, yeah, the impact of that, I believe, was a negative impact.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about this stuff and like you've got your book, Hate Crime Hoax over your shoulder, which this feeds into, right? These events that get blown up in the media and a narrative forms around them. And they have a big impact on how we talk about our identities. And so the kind of meta reason why I wanted to talk to you and dig into this stuff and learn more from you about what you've studied here is that as a parent, it's very hard to navigate a world filled with narratives that when you poke on them break, especially when they have such a huge impact on your identity. And I guess, how do you think about that? How do you think about what's happening with these stories and why they're happening the way they are? Because what you've just described sounds pretty nefarious. So like say creating an organization that claims to be for a thing, has impacts that are pretty obviously negative to the people it claims to care about. Like the exact opposite thing. Like if you say Black Lives Matter and the result of what you do is more black men and women die, that seems bad. So without like reverting to, well, they're just evil and they're twirling their mustaches, what do you think's going on? Like, what do they want to do? You know, what's happening?
I think, well, there are a lot of great questions you asked there. I would distinguish like 2 or 3 things. So first, what should parents do? You should teach your kid tact so he doesn't get into fistfights all the time, or she, but also just what the truth is. Like if you are white, if you're of Caucasian descent, you should not feel guilty about slavery because slavery was a universal practice. That's not even debated. That's just something that as a political scientist or a historian, everyone knows. The word slave comes from Slav. This isn't excusing white slavery, which actually in the USA was a fairly harsh version of the practice. It's just, I don't think if you're a Slavic fighting man, you get your penis cut off. That's a soft version of the practice either. Slavery was just one of those things humans did to each other. If you lost the war, you were getting on that boat. This was the case for whites, blacks, whoever. It's good we're past that, but that's absolutely something you should teach your kids. So what I would do is find an educational system that suits your family's needs. That could be homeschooling. That could, I mean, in most cities, that's just a Catholic school, by the way. I mean, Chicago is a full-on network of Catholic schools. I mean, that's all you need to do. Sister Rosemary is not consumed with guilt about the failures of the West. But that could be a prep school. It could be a good public. It could be whatever. But find the education you need to convey real knowledge, tell your kids real knowledge, teach them enough tact that they'll tell their friends rather than start scuffles at the school by sharing every opinion they have. That's that for that one. But why do people have these opinions that are so far removed from reality? I think if I really had to think about this, because they followed a negative premise to its logical conclusion, or they followed an incorrect premise to its logical conclusion. So, this actually, there are 2 possible explanations. One is that some people are legitimately just hucksters. And I think that absolutely is true for some people. I mean, like the founder of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, I've never met her. She could be a wonderful woman. But, like I was a businessman myself. And, when I see someone bought 6 houses at the end of a capital campaign, you kind of wonder what's going on. You wonder when they're going to see the SEC or the equivalent in their field. I mean, it was funny. Like one of the houses had a helipad. They were all very, very nice properties, except for one in Inglewood, California. All of them, I believe, were in neighborhoods that were something like 85+% white, which was ironic for the founder of a black activist group. So you could have some people that are just out there trying to get money to bring in as much lucre as possible. I think that a more likely result, though, is that people believe something. I mean, we mentioned Marxism, feminism, extreme men's rights activism, so on. This could be anything. Creationism, no offense to devout religious viewers on either of our sides. But I mean, if you believe a premise that's false, 95 to absolutely false, and you follow it logically, you're going to come to faulty conclusions. And this happens all the time. I mean, there's a great argument in the God delusion, and I don't even agree with the thesis of this book necessarily, but Richard Dawkins, the biologist, is talking about why he can debate religion even though he's not a theologian. And he moves away from Christianity for a minute and gives, if I recall, the example of Hinduism. And he says, the argument that I can't discuss the Hindu philosophy because I am not a Hindu Vedic theologian is absurd. Because I am starting from the premise that people have logic. There's a baseline logical ability, which, and this is my line, but makes juries, interdisciplinary journals, journalism, so on down the line possible. And on the basis of this logic, I conclude that there are not invisible 5-armed blue gods. It's a rude description of a friendly rival faith, but it's a logical conclusion you can come to. So I don't need to hear the best defenses of why some of the gods have 6 rather than 5 arms in order to know I don't believe this. I just don't think it's logically true. But if you follow from the premise that I need to understand Hindu philosophy to disagree with it, and further from the premise that a lot of it might be true, you're going to reach conclusions that are pretty much indistinguishable from those of mainstream Hinduism, if that makes sense. So if you're starting from the conclusion that in the Black Lives Matter case, all disparities between groups have to be the result of racism, for example.
Right.
And I mean, I think this is the big one.
This would be sort of the Ibram X. Kendi math.
Yeah, and I really think this is the big one. And I think Colores believes this. I know Kendi believes this. I've debated him about it, at least online. Robin DiAngelo believes this. If you're starting from the idea that any disparity between any 2 groups must indicate racism, because the only other option is genetic inferiority, right? Then you have no conclusion to come to unless you yourself are a vicious racist, but that America is a very racist system. So how do people come to these nonsensical conclusions that racism is everywhere? Police shootings must be the result of racism, and the only solution is disbanding the police? I guess the praxis would be all gaps are caused by racism. There's a gap when it comes to police shootings. And even though this will damage society, we can't allow a murderous racist gap like this one. Now, I would personally say that from a brutal kind of Roman imperial perspective, sure you can. You absolutely don't double the murder rate because your current system is morally flawed. You must be insane. Crucify him. But many people would disagree with that. And if you begin with the starting assumptions of Black Lives Matter, you get to that point logically, I would say.
I did a video a couple weeks ago, maybe it's a couple months ago, about some of these issues, and I cite one of your articles about sort of a kind of the case for Black optimism.
Okay.
That wasn't the title, but I think that might have been a similar article from Coleman Hughes. Yeah. But you've written about all the ways in which we as a society are not maybe shouldn't be indicted as the most racist country on earth. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, empirically, as a political scientist, the United States of America is one of the least racist countries on earth. I mean, this is not very disputed data. It actually, World Population Review, in my opinion, stopped running this information a couple of years ago during the national mental meltdown following the death of Mr. Floyd because of the implications of this sort of plain fact. But I mean, every year there's surveys where well-trained social scientists, and I'd imagine the major universities of the world, in urban areas that you'd expect to be more tolerant than the average, simply ask people how they would feel about having a neighbor of a different race or caste. Is this something you'd object to? This is totally anonymous. I'll look up the details of the project after the call, but it's very well done. It's universally accepted in my field. And the United States of America invariably is one of the countries where the smallest number of people would object to a neighbor of a different race, religion, anything similar. And this is part of a general pattern, actually, where 94% of Americans support interracial marriage. That's true across whites and blacks. I mean, so on down the line. So yeah, we're not the most racist country in the world. We're one of the least.
I have experienced this anecdotally, which is when you travel, and the ironic thing is when you travel to places like Scandinavia,
Okay.
the kind of like racism that you encounter is so much more overt, it's almost shocking to you.
Yep.
Compared to here in the States. Or Japan, which I haven't been to, but I have many friends who've spent time in Japan, and they're like, oh, Japan is just it's overt. And it does seem like where you have very homogenous populations, you just tend to have people who are more overtly racist, more overtly like worried and afraid of people that don't look like them. And then you come to America, where we're a melting pot, and we're used to getting on a subway or going to a grocery store and seeing lots of different types of people and being okay with it. And yet we have this narrative that we are uniquely horrible, that we were sort of born in 1619. And this is permeating our education system. I know your book, your upcoming book is called The Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You. And this feels like one of them. This feels like one of those lies that our kids are being told, that we are this uniquely racist country. So that's one example of how we're not. You just ask people around the world, what else should I as a parent help my kid understand about race in America so that they don't fall into this trap?
Well, there are a lot of different points here. I mean, so first, to engage the main thing you said, I mean, yeah, like most nations are far more overtly racist than the United States. And this isn't just true of white nations, by the way. I mean, so like when you mentioned Japan, the Japanese word for foreigner is still gaijin. I mean, you see this in, anime comic books. Gaijin means foreign devil. And that's extremely, extremely common. The Chinese word for foreigner used for both whites and blacks is guailofan. Excuse my pronunciation, but that means barbarian dog, if I recall correctly. The experience with whites, certainly, probably with black Ethiopians or whatever as well, would have been foreign warriors that were viewed as a bit below those of the Middle Kingdom, much less its elegant, silk-clad diplomats. So, I mean, this is an extremely common attitude. You see this as well in the traditionally, historically powerful black nations, Arabic nations. I mean, there's a famous meme, you see this on Facebook and Twitter, of an Asian American who went to, I believe, Nigeria to help the local black population. And when he got there, he found that Nigeria is a rising, top 30 global economy, and that he was greeted with constant racism. So the image in the meme is like all these black kids pulling their eyes to the side so they can, quote unquote, look Chinese to tease him. It's a whole soccer field doing it. And the guy's like,
I've
what?
not seen this.
It's, I don't know what you'd search for to find it, try to think of something politically correct. But I mean, it's just, that is extremely, extremely common everywhere outside of what some people call the weird zone, the Anglosphere, basically. It's partly due to homogeneity, but even in very heterogeneous countries like Mexico and India, people openly refer to each other as backward caste or lazy forward caste. In Mexico, Chino, Negro, Blanco, people's nicknames mean things like Chinaman. So we have, because of a combination of everything from our civil rights laws to post-British Victorian era politeness, to just extreme diversity. We've mentioned some of the cities in the country. We've come past that. And yes, that absolutely should be recognized. It should be recognized as something whites, blacks, everyone else sacrificed to do. And so the narrative that comes in counter to that, the 1619 narrative, is primarily false. The reason it's false is not even so much that the things that it says, like there used to be a great deal of ethnic conflict in the USA, are inaccurate. It's that they are kind of the 33 degrees of knowledge that was always associated with foolishness or with the devil in European mythology. The assumption is that someone who is listening won't know that Asia, Africa, Arabia, so on, were much worse. That's the great caveat here. We had slaves. Well, everyone had slaves. We helped the world free them. It was the US and the UK that literally armed their navies and blockaded whole countries like Zanzibar to end the global trade in slaves. We ended the international slave trade in the USA in 1808. So, I mean, not being aware of that, only being aware of our warts in the context of what being warts and all means is a foolish approach. Also, a lot of the things said in traditions like that simply are not true. I mean, the idea that the United States began in 1619, slavery didn't begin in the United States until, and I talk about this in Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, but until almost 50 years after that. I mean, when Anthony Johnson and the first black, Aravistes to the USA got here, they were indentured servants. Slavery hadn't yet been formally implemented as a practice. Slavery, of course, is servitude that you can't leave. But the general idea was that if you were a black servant, just as if you were a white servant, you were going to be in bondage for maybe 10 years. Then you were going to be, you'd lost the war, it was going to suck. But then you were going to be released. You were going to, in many cases, be given some land, and you would have the opportunity to buy both black and white servants. So, I mean, when I mentioned the name Anthony Johnson, the first slave owner in the United States, many people would say, was a black man. He was an Angolan sort of lower chieftain captured by the Portuguese during the incessant fighting that existed for males in particular of every group during this period. He was brought to the United States, brought to the Commonwealth of Virginia. He suffered his time as an indentured servant, which is absolutely miserable for almost everyone in these roles. People weren't actually taught to be blacksmiths or something like that. They were used as essentially enslaved farm labor for the length of those contracts, which are often 23 years. His was 10. But he was then released. He ended up getting married, fighting the Indians with his white neighbors, so on. And the case that settled legal American slavery actually involved another man, I think John Casor, who was his bondservant who tried to run away. And Johnson argued that recalcitrant bondservants should be kept permanently by the people who owned them, as I recall the matter. And so he became, there may have been one or two before him in other states, but the first American slave owner. And we're talking about the 1650s, 1660s here. So the 1619 Project idea itself is wrong. Slavery in its full form didn't exist at that time. And the United States, I'll note, also didn't exist. The USA began in 1776. So we had slavery in America from 1776 to 1865. That's it. I mean, it's a shameful, unfortunate block of time, but it's worth comparing that to the entire global sweep of the exact same practice. What should you tell your kids? Which is, I think, your real question. You should tell them all this and more. I mean, I would strongly encourage you to buy what used to be considered just conventional history books, and books in general, from Jared Diamond to Charles Murray, that everyone used to read through about 2010, and have them in a library in your house and just communicate this information. There's not much more to be said than that.
What else have our liberal teachers told us that are lies?
Well, sir, that's a great question. There are about 10 chapters in the book. I usually do these kind of 10 chapter structures that fit together loosely, but I think pretty well. And basically, lies my liberal teacher told me, to answer the question explicitly, each chapter focuses on something that most people now believe. Sometimes I do a statistical analysis. Very often I just look at what the textbooks say, but that is wildly inaccurate. So one such example would be Native Americans were peaceful. They're peaceful people, dances with wolves. They spend all day in making love and growing crops.
Living in balanced harmony with nature.
Well, that actually, even more so than peaceful, I think is a good description of the focus there. Yeah. So that chapter opens with an official Department of Agriculture lesson on Native nations. And they actually say things like this, a la, the Native Americans had no word for want. They never killed an animal out of need or took a fish they did not plan to use, and just on and on and on. A peaceful, harmonious people. This is like a 16-page lesson that's gone out to thousands of schools.
I'm laughing because I know that among the practices for hunting buffalo was to drive entire herds off the edge of cliffs. And this is before you could refrigerate any meat. So almost all of the dead buffalo that would run off the cliff would just rot. So but continue.
No, I mean,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, they would do that. The only meat you would take would be the tongue and the back hump because that's apparently the best part of a buffalo, and you just killed 1,000 of them. Yeah, the natives were interesting people, great warriors, fascinating religious tradition, but the idea that they were any better morally than the people they fought is extremely bizarre, and I think could only have been believed in sort of the very recent past. But just chapter after chapter goes through these things. One of the chapters looks at the idea of the Red Scare. And so the entire question was, were there actually communists in Russia and communist spies in the USA during this time? And to myself or you, that might even seem like an almost stupid, intelligence insulting question. But the answer is yes. I mean, we have a list of papers in political science known as the Venona Papers that look at the Russian agents that were in the United States by name. So Alger Hiss and most of these other people that were protected by entire sectors of the political left were actually Russian spies. And we've known that for 20 years. Dalton Trumbo, as we've gone on making movies and so on, lionizing these guys. So that's a chapter of the book. I do have one chapter. This has already been said extensively on kind of the center right, but I have one chapter looking at slavery globally and not really gloating about the miserable performance of any of the races. We were all doing this, but just saying, well, one of the first human words was slave. I mean, the Sumerian glyph for man from the mountains, there's a similar word that has man from the mountains with chains around his wrists, again, after some kind of military conflict, and that means slave. So, and there's woman from the mountains, which is a little more explicit, and that means slave as well. So, I mean, one of the first things that we did after encountering other people was to fight them. I mean, none of them are all that graphic. It's just like they're drawn on clay with reeds at this point. But I mean, like one of the first things we did after encountering other genuinely different human beings was fight them, take prisoners, take concubines, so on down the line. So to pretend that Western European and American white people invented this over the last couple of hundred years borders on the insane. It's kind of an internalized pathology of guilt. But I mean, there are a number of other chapters. What happened, white flight in the 1960s? What was the real cause of that after Great Society social policy? I also talk about Black and Caucasian family collapse in that chapter. There's another chapter devoted to kind of the lies of today. Are we seeing an epidemic of young men being murdered by police? Are we seeing an epidemic of interracial crime on either side? An epidemic of hate crimes? Is cultural appropriation real? What about white privilege? And then there are 5 more. Each chapter just takes on something that's very popular today, but that has very little evidence supporting it, at least in my opinion.
So there is this thing going on that I don't have an answer for, and I'm curious how you think about it, which is that if you pick up your book and you are the one to drop the scales from the reader's eyes about all of these narratives, one thing you can come away from feeling is that everything is BS, that everything's a lie, that all of our institutions are shot through with liars and crooks and thieves, and that everything is awful, really. Like it's there is like a path to kind of a nihilism. And even if you don't get all the way to being a full cynic, you are still left with a question of, well, who do I trust now? Because all of my teachers lied to me and told me these grand stories on which their entire ideology is based about who's an oppressor and what's the nature of power and reality itself. And they're all sort of lies. How do you think about navigating this world we're in when we are surrounded by so many easily falsified stories from people who claim to be experts and have letters after their names and call themselves doctor and all of that?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you're a professor of gender studies or whatever, you should never call yourself doctor. But I mean, I think that there are two real answers. One of them, to crib a wiser man than I, or at least a better spoken man than I, is trust but verify. So when you see something in mass media, I mean, and this is a trend you see very much on Twitter or Facebook, where you'll see videos of a guy of one race being beaten up by someone of the other, a cop or 3 black guys or something. And there's a mob of people screaming, happens all the time, every day. They'll get you. Don't go outside. Before believing in that kind of nonsense, it's probably a good idea to actually, and I guess this is part of the answer to your question, go look at easily available data and see what reality is. I mean, the national crime rate, it's called the BJS-NCVS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey. Anyone who's graduated from college or a good high school can figure this out, and you just go online and look it up. I mean, I don't want to volunteer myself for 10,000 unsolicited emails, but for you guys watching this, if you email me, if you find me using my sales techniques and email me, I'll tell you where to find the basic crime data or the basic healthcare data in the USA.
Right.
So that I think is a big part of the answer. When you see something, you shouldn't automatically believe it, but that shouldn't make you a trust-free cynic either. There are sources you can believe in, whether that's some reliable local media or your intimate partner, or more importantly, the actual data resources themselves. Like, we're not just making up the national crime data. It might be slanted 5% to the left or the right, depending on the president, but it just really is there. And there's a lot of stuff like that. The second thing I would add is just use common sense. So, I mean, very, very often we see like 3-year cycles of bullshit that end with people recognizing what everybody already knew anyway. So, like, we just saw a big paper on the COVID vaccine that basically said COVID vaccine saved a lot of lives, but boosted myocarditis 600% in young males. And I was like, that exact sentence is what I thought about the COVID vaccine 2 weeks out. Like, obviously, it's good for seniors. Obviously, it's kept some people alive. Also, obviously, you're starting to see people fall over on the pitch. So, like, there's an element of just, this seems to be reality. I'm noticing it. Why shouldn't I believe that? Unless there's a very good reason not to believe, you should generally accept the evidence of your own Mark I eyeballs and of common sense. I'm actually, before I get back into some examples of this trend, just going to repeat, one of the core ideas of Western thought is that there's this skill called logic. I mean, and as, you know, junior professors, we often teach logic 101, ethics 101, American government 101. And using this skill, any country lawyer or homemaker or something like that can serve on a jury, write a letter to the editor of the biggest papers in the country, you know, can do anything along these lines, make shopping decisions that cost $20,000. This just is an ability to decide whether or not to send someone to jail. So when you have this ability to decide to raise your own children to be successes, so when you have this amazing personal ability that almost everyone does, who's a functional taxpayer post-childhood, it's good to rely on it. If you see something that seems absolutely irrational and illogical, like the sentence, some women have 9-inch penises, you should look at that and say, no, that doesn't make sense. And you're probably correct, no matter how many people are speaking against you. But what I'm saying here, to get back to the thought flow of this point, is that very often, after about 2 years of panic, what you'll see is that what everyone knew is revealed to be true. So these studies just kept dropping this past week, right? I mean, there was another one that found that gender affirming care for kids, quote unquote, doesn't work. The Swedes, the British are pulling back from it. The British closed their god-awful Tavistock clinic. It turns out that if you're an emotionally disturbed 13-year-old girl who has anorexia, making a fake penis out of your leg, I don't know if that would be allowed at that age, but a mastectomy would. That's not going to make you better. You probably should treat the underlying issues, eating disorder, cutting, a parental divorce, whatever those might be. And again, that's something that I think most...
Autism spectrum.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think like every businesswoman, female friend that I have made that point, again, 4 years ago. There are people like Hazel Appleyard on Twitter that have been saying nothing but this for maybe a decade. You know, Watson comes to mind. So we now know that the obvious was true. Like a massive double-blinded study found that the obvious was true. What people who are fighting against the obvious will often do, by the way, is try to stop the study. They'll try to derail it at what's called the IRB level. They'll try to prevent you from publishing it. A lot of the people I've mentioned, like myself and Corey Clark, have been on the receiving end of this kind of thing. Like, oh, look at the names on this. And it's just the most conventional ever breakdown of data in a Stater SPSS spreadsheet. So once it gets through, you generally find that even academic, skillfully put together knowledge conforms to reality. So just hold your ground until that happens, I guess would be another piece of advice. But don't give up on logic, hold your ground until it happens, and find reliable sources of data. If someone asks you what crime is, I don't mean to keep beating this horse to death, I've been talking for a bit, but if someone asks you what crime is, go to the National Crime Report, Google FBI UCR, and you'll find that black people are overrepresented, so are whites in the South, but you'll also find that you're not going to be murdered when you walk outside. Don't go on Facebook and say, man, I saw a video. I know what, fill in the gap Hispanics are capable of. That's not reality.
We started this channel kind of in the aftermath of a film I was working on that sort of became Dad Saves America. And it was about how our kids are being raised increasingly to be fragile.
Oh, yeah.
And that there's sort of these three pillars of breakdown: social media, overprotective parenting, and sort of overwrought social justice. A lot of what we're talking about, these sort of narratives of oppression and victimhood that when you take them on are sort of textbook terrible for your psychology.
Yep.
But the funny thing was, at the time, the crime stats were really obvious that crime had come down in America to, I think, the point of like 1963 was the last time it was as low as it was in 2019. And I know it's ticked up, but what's the current? We're sitting here. We're in 2024, beginning of 2024. What is the current picture? Because we're in this election year, everyone's talking about crime and safety. Things have gotten worse than they were 3 years ago. But paint the bigger picture for me.
Well, crime is up pretty dramatically. I mean, with the caveat that this does not represent breakdowns in crime across races and so on. African Americans are overrepresented among homicides, whites among certain other offenses. I don't want to break down every group of Muslims and terror acts and so on. But I mean, illegal immigration, human trafficking, you get a large percentage of Hispanic Americans at present. But I mean, leaving aside who does each specific crime, homicide is generally a decent proxy for the crime rate. It's hard to hide a body. And if you look at that, I mean, I think it's fair to say that crime has ticked back up to mid to late 90s levels. So, I mean, immediately after the loss of, or the death of George Floyd, you saw 20,000 murders a year, which was always the representative bar for a bad year for the first time since 1993. I believe that happened in 21, 22. I couldn't speak for 2023. So crime is up. Now, when people say crime is down, there's kind of a game being played with the statistics, because crime in the 1970s and 80s in urban America was at Columbia levels. I mean, New York, we've already gone through 2,000 plus murders a year. Detroit, I mean, the city nearly depopulated. Chicago, we were just under 1,000 murders a year. So, I mean, what happened in America is that for a bunch of reasons, and the Freakonomics boys would argue, this includes abortion, by the way, this includes some awkward stuff, but for a bunch of reasons, mostly centered on just policing, enforcing the law. I mean, Giuliani and Bratton, I think people disagree with this, but really drove this trend in New York starting a couple of years before they're usually credited with beginning it, which messes up the data a little. But I mean, starting in the 1990s, the very early 1990s, crime started dropping precipitously from those levels, and it basically fell until 2018. Now, there were sporadic jumps there during the BLM era for the first time in a long time, in decades. So in 2015, we saw a small surge in crime, and this is described as the Ferguson effect. But following George Floyd's death, we saw the much larger Floyd effect. And again, this depends how you classify crime. So when I look at crime, I normally look at the BJS index crimes, which are assault, aggravated assault, rape, robbery, and so on down the line. And those jumped pretty dramatically. But I mean, for example, riot, a fray, is not a crime counted by the BJS. So obviously in 2020, if you counted vandalism during a riot as a violent crime, as some of the Europeans do, I mean, you would have seen another million or whatever incidences of violent crime. I mean, whole chunks of major cities were on fire. The Lake Street Business District in Minneapolis was burned to the ground. I mean, Kenosha, Wisconsin, that's not far north of Chicago. Chunks of the city look like bombs hit them. So the Floyd effect was pretty significant, and it brought crime back to not that peak awful era in the early 90s, mid 80s, but back to the levels that we thought we were past, certainly back to 20,000 deaths a year. And I think that's pretty notable. Like, there's obviously something very dishonest about someone saying, well, look, crime is down, and they're using the starting point of 2021. When for every year before 2021, for 30 years, crime had been lower than it was in 2021. And crime today remains higher than it would have been in 2002 or 2005 or 2009. So this is one of those arenas where there's a lot of game playing with the data. The short answer is crime is up, not as much as some people say.
Interesting. What other things outside of the crime and the police do you really feel like are lies that really need to be broken and haven't been broken yet, that we haven't gotten past the sort of psychotic fever dream of the fad thing?
Well, I feel that most of the secondary claims of the modern political left, from Hamas didn't commit rape to the police commit, thousands of murders of unarmed black and, ethnic, white and Latino, that's been added now, but young men per year. I mean, a lot of that's just nonsense. I mean, so I'm going to get to a bigger one now, but just as a brief note on the police shooting rates. So there was a study done a couple of years ago now by Skeptic Research Center that looked at black and urban white men. And they found that the average young man, at least if you consider those categories representative, thought that the number of people that were shot annually by the police who were just unarmed, just male, and just black was like 10,000. So 40% of the people in the study thought that the number was about 1,000 or more. And as I recall the categories, it would have been about 1,000 to about 10,000. Then another 14% thought it was about 10,000, this category. And another 8% thought it was more than that. So you had this incredible breakdown where, what are you talking about, 50+% of the people in this pool thought that the cops were killing between 1,000 and, say, 20,000 unarmed black men per year. Now, the actual number of unarmed people shot by the cops in a typical year is under 100. If you break out black males, it's like 20. Last year, actually, it was 12. So, I mean, there's a fantastic disconnect from reality when it comes to this on the left and in the center that's worse than the disconnect from reality that I see on the right regarding anything. There's nothing, the COVID vaccine might come close, but there's nothing where the right just thinks there have been hundreds of thousands of people killed where nothing has happened at all. I mean, I can't think of one thing.
Why do you think that is, and why would it be ideologically biased?
Well, I think it comes from, there's an entire narrative on the left, which is essentially that the civil rights movement failed, that not much has gotten better in the USA. And I think that a lot of people like myself and Coleman kind of started out writing about civil rights activism, as well as our normal major or graduate school fields or whatever, almost naively. Just the idea was, well, that can't be accurate. These people must be misled. So let's tell them the truth. That's so insane. In reality, when you engage these people and you meet them at conferences and so on, you realize pretty soon that a lot of them know that the USA is not in worse shape today than it was in 1955. But that this is the justification needed for a whole bunch of programs that still exist today, like large boost affirmative action. So, I mean, I and many others have kind of stumbled on this political minefield that's sustained by lying. And every so often you see someone who points this out, like Roland Fryer, just get absolutely torpedoed, where you'll see a piece of data come to light. Like he said, not only what I said, there are 12 unarmed black men shot by cops every year, but also if you break out all males or indeed all citizens, and you just look at people who are stopped by the cops, whites are, I think he said 27.5% more likely to be shot. There's no BLM movement out there protesting for them. There are a lot of broke white guys as well, without being crude. So it was this fascinating finding. It was really a positive finding. The cops need to go a little easier on working class white men, but overall, there's no statistically significant, we would say, discrimination against anyone. It's a good job by these multicultural forces. They meet some tough guys out there. But, that's not how it was presented. I mean, he was accused of having falsified data. His lab was shut based on sexual harassment charges that suddenly popped up from nowhere. I don't mean to mock if that did happen exactly as described and would have been brought to light anyway, but it seems kind of questionable given the circumstances. His accuser was Claudine Gay. The plagiarist
I've
president.
talked about this. And a lot of others have. It's been interesting. It's like, a recent show I saw someone saying Claudine Gay is starting to feel like one of the bad guys that pops up at the end of Scooby-Doo movies. It was Claudine Gay all along.
Yeah, well, I think it kind of was what Claudine Gay represents. So, I mean, I think that there's a movement that is based around a narrative of what are basically falsehoods that exists to kind of secure revenues. Like, I don't think it's particularly innocent anymore. I mean, you could go through the groups. Like, I mean, when I mentioned BLM, GNF, that's one of about 130 organized Black Lives Matter groups. And like the total amount of money given by corporate America to Black Lives Matter was $11.6 billion. And that's an article from The Economist. That's July 2021, I believe, as mainstream as it gets. Just Google BLM gets 11.6 billion. But I mean,
billion with a B. Just I want to make sure I heard billion with a B.
Yeah, billion. Yeah, BLM GNF alone got, I think it was 180 million. Like when we were tracking these gifts to these trans groups, and we were tracking gifts in the 6 to 7 figures only. Yeah, these people got a lot of money. And I mean, you know, Al Sharpton, he's kind of a little player these days. No hate for the Reverend. But I mean, the National Action Network never went anywhere. That's probably 50 to 80 million a year. Whatever Jesse used to be, Rainbow Coalition, that's now Our Push. That again, that's a mainstream civil rights group these days. And you go on down the line. I mean, you've got similar organizations for Muslim Americans. I mean, I mentioned working for a large gay rights group before it moved down the trans path. I mean, they have a 9-story building in D.C. That's got to be worth tens of millions just in and of itself outside of fundraising kit year by year. I mean, SPLC has a well-invested endowment of 470 million. Last I looked, probably about 600 million now. So there's a massive body of entities that has an actual vested interest that's at Fortune 1000 corporate levels in certain policy positions being maintained. That's not some sort of right-wing game. If I were the senior vice president of diversity at Sony, I mean, I would have a pretty significant interest in this myself. Although, as I understand, that's a Japanese company. I doubt they have one. But just it is what it is. The broader point that I was going to make here, though, is I think things like the police shooting storyline are just little offshoots. They're sort of octopus tentacles from a deeper narrative, which is the kind of post-Marxist narrative that we've talked about, which is that every gap in performance between people is due to prejudice. And this leads to almost every inherently nonsensical position that we see today. From why is there so much insistence on the gender pay gap, now that we know that it vanishes when you adjust for the jobs people prefer to do, to much more, in my opinion, serious things. I mean, why is there the constant focus in business on equity across every profession? The baseline idea is that any gap that you see has to be due to prejudice. I'll get to the point there. That is an incredibly false idea, but it's incredibly pervasive in business and academia, really every field I've been in. It's just wildly wrong. So that probably is the big thing you need to cut out when you ask that question.
So I'm curious if what we're dealing with this sort of equity thing, right? This sense of, oh, if I see a disparity, it means there's a problem. If it's really this very deep, like zero-sum bias we have that's like goes back to the pre-industrial human life, where if you have more berries in your stack, you took them from a tree that only has so many, and that means you must have taken them from the rest of us, and so you're bad because you're hoarding the fixed number of berries. And it's that, I mean, it does feel like that zero-sum intuition, which modern society solved, is at the root of a lot of this stuff, at the root of like the communist sense of exploitation and this like equity thing. Like, well, if you're doing better, that means I must be doing worse. I mean, is that how you think about it? Or how do you think about the like again, trying to be as charitable as possible, like what drives belief in things that we can disprove pretty easily when it comes to these equity claims?
That's an interesting question. I mean, so the conflict with kind of core human nature might explain reluctance to accept capitalism and so on in the first place. So for a very long time now, I don't actually really, as someone who occasionally hunts, I don't know if I totally agree with that analogy, even for primitive tribesmen. I mean, like if someone else kills an elk, that doesn't mean there's one less elk for you to kill. I mean, it means you have to walk a little further, or it might mean there are more elk for you to kill. The elk herd is in the area. You should, instead of feeling jealousy, take advantage of this opportunity. Learn to track better or something. But I mean, nonetheless, I understand what you're saying. And I think that certainly in the past, there was a more fixed level of wealth, let's say. And for a lot of history, you got wealth by taking it from other people. So, I mean, plunder, reaving. Yeah, if you look at like the Romans versus the Persians and so on historically, there would be a fairly concentrated amount of gold in one borderland area. And the way you would get more gold for your family is that you'd lead your horsemen in a successful raid against the other side's horsemen. And you'd get in through their line of defense enough to raid one wealthy peasant's farmhouse. And you'd grab a bag that had 5 pounds of gold, and you'd laugh gleefully, and you'd ride back to your lands with like a daughter over your shoulders and waving your swords. And this was like classical historical barbarism. It's what people actually just did. I mean, they'd break the border, raid each other. I mean, you'd steal more often in terms of like the whites versus the natives in America. You'd steal cattle, sheep, horses. So I think the basic idea that you could make money without taking it from people or having other people grow it from the ground for you did strike a lot of people as amazing. And historically, there's always been a tone of what I'd call like peasant resentment against people that could do this, like the Jewish bankers are stealing from us. And what that doesn't recognize is that the Jewish bankers are providing a service that dramatically improves the community. If it's not available, if money is not available to be lent that allows the development of farmland during the off season or something like that, that just doesn't happen. You paying back an additional 5%, mostly in barter, is a pretty small price to pay for that. But that's always been viewed as a sort of dark magic, like they're conjuring money from nowhere. They're lying. They're unnatural. They're violating the natural way of things. Does that have a lot to do with what we're seeing today? Maybe. It's an interesting hypothesis. I wonder if there's a way to test it. To me, the more key point is just that the equity idea is wrong. I mean, and to me, all of quote unquote wokeness comes down to these three prongs. Like prong one, I said this for NRO in a pretty lengthy piece actually, but prong one is all gaps between people are due to discrimination. The only other option is something totally unacceptable, like genetic inferiority. Two, these gaps thus give proof of discrimination within our society. We don't need any other proof. And three, the solution is equity, which is proportional representation, regardless of performance. What we actually find is that for a bunch of reasons, including genetic reasons, if you're looking at why men and women do different things or why Samoans do well in the NFL or something like that, probably, different groups of people perform at radically different levels at different times. And often the reasons for this are totally uncontroversial. I mean, when I first looked at Black, white, and Latino personal incomes, one of the things that struck me was that you could close a third of the difference in most states, sometimes more than that, just by looking at median or modal age. So, I mean, the most common, I say this a lot, it's not a particularly brilliant point, but it's one that's just ignored all the time. The most common age for a white American right now, 58. Most common age for a Black American's modal average, perfectly fair description of it, is 27. The most common age for Hispanic Americans, 11. I mean, that's a younger, much more immigrant-based community right now, large, traditionally Catholic families, a lot of kids. So when you say, well, there's a high crime rate in these immigrant communities, you'd have to adjust for age. Teenage men are the historical warriors. They're more likely to commit crimes. But also when you say, well, they have less savings and whites are indeed blacks, what a bunch of bums, you have to adjust for age. There's no practical way to expect an 18-year-old, much less an 11-year-old, to have much in the bank, unless you're talking about a piggy bank. So, I mean, all this has to be done every time you look at gaps between groups to make any sort of point, and no one ever does it outside of a few obscure academic papers on the right wing of things. So that's my main problem with the equity narrative and with the disparities equal discrimination narrative. It is probably founded in deep human psychological realities, but in the here and now, it's also just wrong. So if I were going to cut out one belief that a lot of people have that's very damaging, it would be that one, I think.
How has your own identity shaped the way you think about these issues around race? It's one of these things that's like simultaneously, it's difficult to grapple with because, so Coleman Hughes is out right now with a new book about the case for colorblindness, right? And I'm 46. I graduated college in the late 90s, and it would be totally uncontroversial to say I support a colorblind society in like 1999. Today, that is like declaring yourself a Nazi in many quarters. So, how do you think about where identity and race matters? Like, and where it just shouldn't or doesn't, and what colorblindness means, and how do you like experience that argument?
Well,
Given that, everything we're talking about logic and empiricism, but then you're getting treated by the world in particular ways, especially when you come out and say some of these things.
Well, I mean, I support a basically colorblind society in the way that anyone who played a varsity sport during the 1990s or went to high school or college then, I mean, that's the era you mentioned as well, pretty much does, at least unless they are a personal bigot themselves. This was something we already mostly accomplished, by the way. I mean, if you look at the race relations ratings from that era when people were looking at, Jordan and Bird on the television and, cheering against them passionately, but only as men, really. I mean, 75% of whites, 69% of blacks, I think rated race relations is very good. You look today, that figures down to around 33%. So, I mean, we've progressively become worse. We can empirically, measurably look at whether modern woke approaches have made race relations better, and they haven't. They've made race relations dramatically poorer. That's not debatable. Like, we know it. We keep records of this every single year. So, I mean, a couple of different things. I guess when you ask, what do you mean by colorblindness? I think what you mean by colorblindness is just that assuming that race itself is a trait that has zero or a neutral value. Like, most people probably feel a small level of extra attachment for their own group. I mean, I'm biracial. I'm now upper middle class. I'm American, a number of other things. And in situations like watching sport, that would matter. I would cheer for an American boxer over a foreign one, always. Sometimes a black guy over a white guy. What are their tattoos? What are their flags? Are there other associations? I'm half Irish. That's certainly something you see in the pugilistic field represented. But I think beyond that, if you're hiring for a job, which is something we've both done, race should be absolutely neutral. I mean, you have columns, education, a diploma, and before that, a degree, performance, the equivalent of an IQ or EQ test, if you could sneak that in for this job, how'd the interview go, that kind of thing. Race shouldn't be one of them. It isn't for most people, at least in our generation. It doesn't matter. And that's the moral problem that most people have with both racism and affirmative action, by the way. That it's extremely weird to look at a potential executive and say, okay, he was 18 points behind the top guy here, but we're going to give him 20 points for being Hispanic. Like, that feels atavistically kind of slimy. Even if you understand there's some kind of social purpose here, and maybe you can do that at the grand scale if it comes to some kind of government grant, but you don't want people making those decisions and getting used to that kind of calculation ever. So that's what colorblindness means. It just means not judging people based on race. It's an extremely normal, practical idea. It's very easy to do. In fact, so we're talking about executives. There are whole numbers of ways to do that. But I mean, like, you can simply remove the names from resumes so that you have no chance of looking at someone's race. I often have done that. So that, I think that's a good way for a society to operate. Why has this become a bit taboo? I think that it's a result of what we're talking about. There's a strong vested interest in what I call the old wars, capital O, capital W, continuing. So if you run a group, like, let's pick one of the little ones. We said National Action Network, maybe 80 million a year. You run a group that takes in 50 to 80 million a year griping about race. Do you stop griping about race? What would be the end result of you no longer griping about race? You go back to being a local lawyer? I guess he's a TV host now. But I mean, what about Ben Crump? He doesn't take any more dubious race cases. Trayvon Martin's former lawyer, who's now there every time someone gets shot by the police. You go back to domestic violence defenses, or I mean, I'm not sure that was.
It reminds me of that Upton Sinclair quote that a man cannot understand what his paycheck depends upon him not understanding.
Yeah, you will never gain by wagering on a man to understand something when his paycheck depends on him not understanding it. And I think Upton was talking about religious divines, where people, school teachers and brilliant backwoods preachers and so on for years would struggle with the basic concept of evolution, and you kind of understand that and even sympathize with it. You're not going to end your career, especially since some level of disputation between religion and science continues, by saying, well, okay, I agree that what my opponent says is 100% correct. In this arena, though, it's actually less sympathetic. I mean, we're talking about a situation where there was near race war level conflict. It's over. We can document that it's over, and people are saying that it continues. So, I mean, let's look at that and unpack it for a second. Have you ever looked at that psychological experiment where they showed people blue cubes with some purple ones mixed in, and when they took the purple ones out, like, different shades of blue were identified as purple?
You know, it's funny you should say this. I don't know if I was recently looking at something similar, and that is, I think maybe this is actually in the same category of study, which is that we have this ability to become more sensitive.
Yes.
As things get more subtle.
Yes.
And so you can actually double, I saw the one study showed you can double the ability to detect very slight variations in hue with practice. Is that kind of what you're talking about, or is this something else?
Yeah, it's the same thing. There's a whole genre of these studies, but in the one that I'm referring to, people were looking at, and I think the original colors were purple and blue, so let's just keep those. People were shown a bunch of cubes of purple and blue, and they were asked to pick out the purple cubes, and they did. And they isolated every purple cube. Every purple cube was bad in our analogy, thrown to the side. Now, the host, the organizer of the experiment, eventually just stopped running purple cubes, which would be the equivalent of old school racism today. So you have different shades of blue. Some shades of blue are more purpley than others, but they're all things cerulean that anyone would recognize as blue. Now, the expectation was that people would just say there are no more purple cubes. The problem is solved. The problem of the purple infestation. Let's all go home, get lunch. What actually happened was that people started identifying different shades of blue as purple, like the shades of blue that were closest to conventional purple. And this went on for a while. I don't know if the experiment ever ended without the experimenter ending it. And I think not only is this going on right now because some people have a rational interest in it going on, what they're doing when it comes to certainly a lot of the race stuff. Also, I mean, I've called out the feminist / MRA feuding online, a lot of these categories. In situations where there used to be a real problem, 30+% of men, if you recall the 1970s, probably 20+% of women, if you think about, people made jokes about my wife threw a skillet at me, so I hit her. I mean, people were domestically abusive fairly regularly. We've now largely broken this problem. People don't tend to throw skillets at their husband or their wife. Have people said we're in an era of happy marriages now and started settling down at a higher rate? Hell no.
Of course not.
No. What we've done is redefine what not just potentially abusive, because I agree some of this can reach that level, but over the line abusive behavior that has the same legal penalty in many cases of what we just described is. We've just changed it. We recently changed the definition of sexual assault itself. Well, that's not the topic of this show. But I mean, so if you say, well, we may have gotten rid of most physical assault from women and 80% of it from men, are we in the clear? No, you can say, well, now our focus is emotional and verbal assault. That doesn't mean there are no genuinely abusive people today, but what we've seen is actually no change at all in the recognition that most relationships are better. In fact, men and women are both more depressed about relationships than they ever have been. We're seeing something similar in race relations. Like there's almost no old school racial violence. There are no lynchings, even outside of ghetto schools. There are very few beatings of white or black kids, Twitter videos aside, for being the wrong race. If you're Italian American and you go to a mostly Irish and Mexican school, you're not going to be beaten up by 15 guys like you might have been in the Bridgeport neighborhood in Chicago in 1967. That's not a thing that's going to happen. So have we embraced this? No, not really. We've turned toward microaggressions. I mean, many different terms of this time. And I think that's just the effect we're describing.
This is sort of comes back to this, what we were talking about a little while back, right? Which is, so aggression becomes like, well, now we need to have microaggression, but a new generation will feel a microaggression as if it's being punched in the face. In fact, now they'll say, oh, silence is violence, but also speech is violence. So violence becomes not violence. Do you see an end to this cycle, or are we doomed to continually adapt to being ever more subtly offended to the point where no, there's only one shade of blue, but now we're sort of imagining the purple in the mix of a single mathematically, chemically created set of all identical blue shades?
No, I don't think people in the United States in particular are going to put up with this. I mean, there's something like 4 million people serving in the military right now. We generally win wars against, and that includes civilian workers and so on, National Guard. But I mean, like, there are plenty of people that have real risk involved jobs. I think it's going to be difficult to avoid that if you look at, say, truckers and so on. We're a car-based society, so I mean, roughly 50,000 people per year are killed just tooling around on the highway. I was nearly in a car wreck yesterday. I mean, we're a society where 10% of the population hunts. I mean, so I think that this again gets into the importance of teaching your own family, your own kids, what reality is. Enroll them in something like a jujitsu dojo if they get to 10 or 12, and they'll understand what actual violence is. And they're rolling even with friends. People are picking them up and slamming them on the ground and all this sort of stuff. And that is, I mean, pankration, the Greek martial art, is another thing where people literally do that. Boxing. So I think that there are enough people that tackle football. There are enough people involved in those actual competitive activities, experiencing actual pain, going on to do a couple years on the service, just driving down the road and, you know, seeing the aftermath of impacts with humans or large animals. I don't think people are going to truly believe that your girlfriend arguing with you means you've been the victim of violence. No, I don't think that's going to be a majority position. And this is actually a different issue. One of the things with a lot of these ideas on the woke political left, there are some ideas on the right that are nearly as bad that have broader appeal. I mean, there's a petition online right now, the Repeal the 19th petition, that has something like 4 million signatures from people arguing that women shouldn't vote. So, I mean, there also is that backlash to communist sort of mainstream, almost fascistic population impulse, which can be very dangerous and very widespread. And I'm worried about that as well. But I think when it comes to fringe academic communist ideas, they have a limited reach, and that's good. I mean, I actually asked that question on Twitter once. It was a totally anonymous poll with a link to SurveyMonkey. And I asked, do you believe that some women have 9-inch penises? It's not just a glib question. It's a trans line that was used in a meme that Gad Saad includes in his book on mind viruses. And I expected, because my page has a pretty bro-y audience, but it also has everyone's kind of like feminist girlfriend and fiance, I expected like 30% yes. And I divided the poll into men and women. The yes response rate, if I recall correctly, was 1%. Like, anonymously, no one was actually going to say they agreed with that. No one actually believed that to be true. It was the emperor has no clothes in real life. And we see that all the time with, would police defunding be a good idea? Do Black Americans have a higher crime rate than white Americans? Do white Americans also have a high crime rate? Is mass immigration good? Everyone knows what the answer is. There's just a reluctance to deliver it. So I think when we're talking about these academic ideas, the real question is, how can you overcome the reluctance?
I'm reminded of a concept called collective illusions, that people believe that others hold a position that they don't have. And so they feel compelled to say the thing they don't believe because they think everyone else believes that, when in reality, almost nobody believes it. And so we all end up saying nonsense, thinking we all agree, or that enough people agree that it's impolite. And it just begs the question, like, what sort of game theoretic trap are we in that no one's willing to say, hey, isn't that not true? I mean, it's the emperor has no clothes.
That's exactly that. I mean, not at all to bust in, but that's what I was going to say. Like, if you're talking about collective illusion or mass formation psychosis in a psych or poli-sci textbook, the opening discussion will be the emperor has no clothes, the ancient story. We don't really need to get into complex game theory to explain that. It's just sort of the prisoner's dilemma. Like, everyone, quote unquote, snitching, everyone dishonorably speaking is the best outcome for everybody. I mean, like, if your neighbor is a lunatic idiot and he believes this thing and you speak along with him, you're not punished. And if you speak the insane thing, if you assume the insane group is temporarily in power and your neighbor is a lunatic idiot or your neighbor disagrees with you, he's likely to get punished, whereas you're likely to be rewarded, at least while the nutty folk are in power. So this is something that's very old among humans. I posted online a couple of days ago, like, individual self-identification of your sex, especially for men, has to be the craziest policy people have ever adopted. And a lot of my friends are actually other academics that do things like study religion. People are like, nope, yeah, that's not really true. I mean, for a long time in the Catholic European countries, denying that the sun orbited the earth was punishable by 8 lashes. It was like, shut up. You know, okay, I get the point. But there were like dozens of examples of all this where people would be told absolutely crazy stuff. I mean, there was a period during the early American era of psychotherapy where women who reported what we would now call orgasms were told they were nymphomaniacs and insane. I mean, just a bunch of stuff like this. I'm not going to go deeper and make any jokes, but that's the thing that happened. There was another period where people who reported over intense emotions, I'm sure you know this as well, but were given lobotomies. The solution to a number of mental disorders was to have an ice pick shoved into your brain. All the experts were saying it. So the idea that we are today in a unique era of lunacy, separate from historical Islam or historical extreme Catholic and Orthodox Christianity or the other religions overseas or the things that the first wave of feminism was reacting to or any of these other eras, I mean, that's actually pretty questionable. We're just showing that same ability to believe stupid shit.
That's the best form of optimism I've heard in a while, actually. I want to ask a question that I sort of maybe is a hard question, maybe not, which is you've focused on things that put you in the heterodox with the academy.
Yeah.
And certainly among like Black academics, right? Is that fair to say? Yeah. How do you guard yourself against being a reactionary, against sort of embracing I take the contrarian point of view?
That's a good question.
And that's my identity now is I'm the contrarian. I'm super skeptical when something seems left and woke, and now I fall into traps. And I'll give you one example from recently that's related to everything we're talking about, which is this video that I did about this Obama movie, the Leave the World Behind. I talk about some of your work in that video. And one of the things I also reference is this Minneapolis movie about George Floyd. And it seems like that movie's presentation, which when you watch it, feels like, wow, I guess Derek Chauvin was innocent. Upon closer inspection, it turns out that movie maybe is not enough of a full story for you to change your position. And so I think I got over my skis saying, like, a lot of my commenters were saying George Floyd wasn't murdered. This is a BS story, just like all these others. And I was hesitant to say anything about that. And then in that video, I said, no, I guess I was wrong. I guess I got bamboozled. But then maybe not. Maybe it turns out actually, no. This is more complicated. And I was maybe leaning into that heterodox position. How do you think about that? How do you guard yourself against it? How do we keep ourselves from becoming like celebratory fringe people from the reactionary right?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. I think that the short answer is just what we do with stuff from the left, which is continue to have faith in data, common sense, logic. I mean, at both of our levels, you can get some of the data yourself. You can commission it, put it together yourself. Then you know it's true. People have trust in you if you're a producer of information that is viewed as reliable. So, I mean, it's the same thing. So, I mean, first, as read the George Floyd thing, like, I don't know enough to say whether this is true or what the movie is accurate or not. I found The Fall of Minneapolis pretty convincing. People are now saying it was rebutted, but the rebutter, while I also like him, is a left-wing writer on policing called Radley Balco. So, I mean, very often, the reality is kind of just in the middle. Like, I think the George Floyd case was so sensitive that folks are kind of jumping on any bandwagon that makes the response to the conventional narrative look bad. But I'm not really sure why we would believe, Mr. Balco over one of the better political news hosts from that city. I mean, they should have a debate or something. Right now, I don't consider that to be resolved at all.
Okay, interesting.
So the George Floyd case itself is an interesting one. Like, obviously, I don't think anyone thinks Derek Chauvin is the epitome of ideal policing. But, like, once you get past that, there actually are practical questions. And, like, the most practical question is, would being put in a tough but common hold have killed George Floyd if he hadn't eaten all of the meth and fentanyl that he had on him at the time of his arrest? Like, that would be the question that would determine a murder charge versus a manslaughter charge or no charge in front of a jury that was just looking at, like, rural cop X and, like, poor Caucasian victim Y. That's the question. I think when you look at something like 11 milligrams of processed product from 2 hard drugs in someone's bloodstream, I trained as a lawyer before becoming an academic while we were talking about like crazy urban stories and the background and all that. But I mean, it's kind of hard to just say there's no reasonable doubt in that case. Not that Chauvin's a good cop and should get his badge back, but like there's no 35% doubt that could have happened. Like, as a juryman, it's going to be very difficult for me, if I'm not watching a riot outside the courtroom window, to make that call. And I think, obviously, what happened in that case was heavily, how to put this politely, heavily influenced by affairs in the country at that time. I mean, this is a little before we saw the left and the right literally fight in the street in Kenosha, where both sides had guns. You've got the Wild West standoff. Rittenhouse, justifiably, legally, but unfortunately shoots 3 people. Can't have that. But I mean, like, people knew that stuff was, they were one step away from it. So that obviously influenced the jury verdict, in my opinion. You almost never see a sentence of, like, what was it, murder 2, murder 3, and manslaughter? Those are different crimes. You can't commit murder 1 or murder 2 and manslaughter. You can't have the intent to kill someone and then accidentally kill them through recklessness. I mean, it's been a while since I opened a law book. I'm sure I might be off by a word or two, but that's insane. So, I mean, I don't think that narrative has been entirely rebutted. The question is, would Mr. Floyd have been killed had Chauvin not, had he been restrained the exact same way, but he'd not taken all those drugs? And we're never going to know that. Any case but that one, if that's on the table and you have 2 coroner's reports, that's probably something like a mistrial. So that was the unfortunate and crazy situation. But beyond the George Floyd thing, like, how do you not become, I described a former punk rock friend of mine who's now a rock-ribbed Republican recently as just having the politics of anti. Like, as a young man, he was getting in brawls, the government's evil, we're giving money to Israel, not Palestine. And if you ask this guy why we should give money to Palestine, he's like, I don't know. They're not the man, like Israel. And now it's the same thing in reverse. Like, we're giving money to Ukraine, fighting Russia. Why should we help Russia instead? I don't know. They're not the man. They're our old enemy. It's the same thing in reverse. It's anti-politics. I think I already said this, but just the same tools of logic and common sense are what you use to get out of this. I'll say 2 things on the right that may irritate some people, but I've actually looked, and these may be National Review columns at some point. It's up to the magazine to approve them, obviously. But I looked at some of these claims that were being made by big names on the right, most of whom I like, by the way, most of whom do pretty good work most of the time. But one of them was like, because of DEI, we're going to see planes falling out of the sky. And the other one was like porn and video gaming are burning young men's brains. And both of them sounded kind of plausible. I'm a good data guy. I figured it would take like a half day to check these. I looked. They're just bullshit. I mean, like, the first claim, planes are falling out of the sky, only like 5% of pilots are minorities. And they're all like 50-year-old veterans. 3.5% black, almost all ex-Army and Air Force. 2.2% Asian, almost all ex-Army and Air Force, either here or somewhere else. They're some of the best pilots. To find this out, all you have to do is go to the FAA. So, I mean, like, once you know that, if you still keep saying, yeah, see a black pilot, that plane's plunging. Yeah, this is just racism. So how do you know that? You just go to the FAA, you check the number of black pilots, and you check their scores to the extent you can. That's it. That's done. Did it. It's not a problem. Done. The porn and gaming thing, that's a more interesting one. Obviously, if you're a guy speaking to the young man, you shouldn't spend all day sitting around your house in your pajamas, watching other people have sex and shooting people that don't exist. But like, the actual idea of like, do these men's minor vices, do these affect your brain? Is it like dopamine surging that's going to affect you more than anything else? If you do an hour with the dopamine research, you find that everything causes dopamine to surge in your body. Scoring when you play basketball does, no pun intended. Actually having sex certainly does about twice as much as either pornography or gaming. Boxing, like, you can think some of these things are healthy and some of them aren't, but there's absolutely no evidence that the normal level of usage of either of those things has any effect on guys. I looked at the sex crime rate over the years to see if there's any evidence that correlates with like pornography use. I found 2 things. One, guys have been using a lot of arguably too much porn since like 1980. That's when stores selling it popped up in every good-sized town. We don't have those anymore. So you have to look at alternate mechanisms of delivery. That's the same amount. And 2, like, I guess the point would just be, no, there's no correlation between that and rape. If anything, there's a slight decrease. People are at home. They're interacting less with women. So you can say, look, I think this is morally trash. Get out of your house, get a job. But you certainly can't say, like, the young men of this country are being driven mad. That's wrong. So very often you can just empirically look at data on the left or the right and see what reality is. I think that's the point there.
Alex Epstein, who's a friend of mine, has this book, The Fossil Future,
Oh yeah.
makes a point along these lines that I really like a lot, which is he says, look, the problem we have is not that we don't have good expertise. We actually have pretty good expertise. The problem is that the information system that takes the underlying, like, legitimate people's research turns it into progressively more idiotic nonsense.
Yes.
With each iteration. It's this sort of it's just like the most regressive thing ever. By the time you get to a politician, you start with, like, in the case of climate change, which is the focus of that book, the worst case scenarios of the IPCC's underlying report says that humanity will be 2 times richer in 2100.
Yeah.
And then by the time you get to AOC, she's like, we're all going to be dead in 12 years. And that is like a statement that is just a whole cloth fabrication.
Yep.
But each step along the way, more nonsense is added until we're in full-blown lying, making stuff up on the fly. How do you think about that? How do you understand that process of corruption of expertise?
Yeah, I think that's something everyone sees as an author or a writer. I mean, even for myself, I love all my publishers, but I always joke that your book, if it's going to be a potential bestseller, is going to end up with some title like, I mean, even like mine, like Hate Crime Hoax, How the Other Side's Selling a War. And, you know, you're just used to that as an author. But if you ever talk to a sci-fi author, like...
They're saying it with it right over your shoulder.
I love the book. I love Ragnarok. But it's just something like, I once asked a sci-fi author why the cover of his book, it was like a woman on all fours holding a sword. And like the book itself is this well-written book about like wars in another universe. And he was like, do you think I painted the cover, bro? Like it's just everything that you present to the public, as I'm sure you know, is going to be run through marketing. It's going to be run through 15 or 20 people that read it. It's going to be run through reviewers. And yeah, it's going to come out differently. My academic and public intellectual articles are often treated in the same way. You know, I'll say something like, you know, there's still racism, but affirmative action counters it. And the headline will be like, Uncle Tom Riley says no systemic racism exists. You know, so that's the type of thing you're going to see. With climate change and with fossil fuels, I do think this is problematic because we're not just talking about even something as important as ethnic fighting. We're talking about something that people really genuinely think is going to kill them. What the climate change data, because I suspect there's a pretty large audience, what the climate change data actually finds is that in about 125 years, the world's going to be 2.5 degrees warmer. And that could have some pretty substantial impacts. So what they say very often in the papers is if we don't meet this carbon threshold, we won't be able to go back and deaths will occur, which is correct. Like, we won't be able to get back to X level of temperature for like 1,000 years, and that'll cause 20,000 deaths. And I don't want to say that doesn't matter, but there are 8 billion people in the world. So that's the original starting analysis. And this will be part of a paper that's chock-a-block with graphs. You mentioned that one of them is going to be income of the world during each of these hypothetical years. That always increases. So when people say climate change will cost $20 trillion, that's against a baseline of whatever, like income would be 3 times as high, instead it'll be twice as high. And that's if we choose to make the decision to bail out Somalia and India. Now, again, there's a ruthless Roman emperor frame. You would just say sort of like, why would we support our lower income enemies? But I think in the USA, given our current level of guilt, and India is not an enemy, Somalia, I guess, isn't currently. We fought them. But I mean, I think we probably will do that. So what you're talking about is, drop from 3x to 2x. That's what we lose $100 billion or $100 trillion means. Deaths will occur means there's certain projections caused by heat death, and they haven't adjusted for cold death yet. I'm kind of going on and on here, but if you actually take the full paper, it includes a ton of things. What they take is the one sentence, irreversible death will occur. And even that's like the New York Times. So, okay, we understand human death will occur. That is tragic, or so it is conventional to pretend that humans are mortal creatures. The other options might be worse. But from there, you go to like AOC, who reads a paragraph-long synopsis from her staffers and who says we're all going to die. We've got 12 years or death. That's what the full paper, which is 115 pages with graphics, is condensed to, because in 12 years, it'll be impossible to reverse 1/4 of 1 degree of climate change, which is projected to cause X number of heat fatalities, but also to save X number of lives as cold fatalities decrease. So there's the wonky reality, and then there's the crazy, crazy spin on it.
As we, I think, come to a close,
Okay.
I want to talk about how you think about where we head in this world of like information. So, you are looking at the data, you are a social science, you're a political scientist, you're doing social science, you're trying to do it honestly.
Yep.
And now we have this world in which we've got chatbots and all kinds of things that are making it, I think, even harder to necessarily, what's the true sources? Where are my senses going to get tricked? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about like where we're heading as a society, specifically in the West, like America, the Western world? Are we, have we peaked? Are we going to keep muddling our way through to a better tomorrow? How do you think about this?
I'm optimistic about our upper end and overall technological level. I'm pessimistic about our average general level of knowledge. And I would distinguish those two pretty sharply. So I think in terms of everyday quality of life provided by a still not totally insane leadership class, the world in 100 years will be better than the world today. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. I don't think most people think we'll have some kind of crude form of fusion power. I don't think anyone denies that we'll have human space colonies, the dragon and the eagle will be warring in space, that kind of thing. In terms of the level of knowledge that the average person has, I think that we're going to have a lot of idiocracy light going on. I mean, if you look at this from if you look at this from any perspective, culturalist, the trends the schools are going, hereditarian, we're not supposed to ever discuss genetics, but I mean, the less educated you are, the more likely you are to have multiple children in the USA right now. I mean, just like on and on and on through all the trend lines, it's very likely that there are going to be a lot of people who aren't extraordinarily functional and who are going to be fed kind of pablum very consistently. Like the chatbot thing, what is it, Google Genesis or Genery or whatever, that was like the Pope, if you ask them to generate an image of the Pope, it's all like muscular black guys and Native American women and old Indian.
This is hot off the presses right now. It's completely nuts. You like can't get Google's chatbot to generate white people. And I hate saying white people because, especially as an Italian American, I've never grown up thinking of myself as white.
Sure.
It's such a ludicrous metaphysical category. But even so, according to Google, sorry, I can't do that. Like, you try it, you can replicate this as of today. Hey, create an image of a white family. No, I can't do that. Anything about race, I can't do. Hey, generate a Chinese family. Sure. Generate a black family. Sure.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's going to be the crudeness is going to be taken out of it. So heterodox upper middle class people won't have something they can so easily criticize. But you see this already across the map right now. Like, if you are an ordinary mid-wit high school student, and it feels mean to say mid-wit high school student, none of them are geniuses yet, but if you're just a guy who's in Iowa, future IQ 105, you have a paper to write, you want to go out with your girlfriend after, and you Google like Daily Wire to see what the top conservative brand is doing, you're going to notice that there are 14 pages of negative scandals and reports and so on, and then a few positive comments about the host. And you're going to probably assume that that reflects the reality around the show. Those boys must have done something awful. Because you're just a normal person. You don't think Wikipedia is run by a cabal of frequent editors who are mostly junior professors at semi-elite second-tier colleges, and they've gotten so crazy with their reviews that the founder of the site has gone rebel and is on Twitter saying it's worthless. You don't know that. I mean, so you're just going to say, okay, Daily Wire, maybe I won't get my news from them. And that kind of thing, that is the real risk with AI chatbots. Just like I don't think climate change is a risk to destroy the world, I don't think these chatbots are going to take over and start sending missiles flying into human cities to reduce global temperature or something like that. All you have to do is program them not to. Like, I mean, I've talked to some very high-end computer scientists about this. Yeah. And it's like, can they actually achieve sapience? And the computer science, as opposed to philosophy of science guys, are like, no. All you have to do is program the damn thing that it has to take orders from humans in the control lab. Like, there are a dozen things you can do. I tend to assume that that is true. Like, I don't think that Google AI is going to control the world. I think the real issue with Google AI is that it is going to contain, and this would be just as bad if the right controlled it. Like, what are some great birth control techniques for me as an 18-year-old girl that wants to party with her boyfriend? Chastity. Like, I mean, it would be just like, you could easily see the same things being put into.
I mean, it does work
100% of the time. What are the 100% accurate forms of birth control? It's just abstinence pops up on the screen. But I mean, like, you could easily see this kind of thing coming from the right as well. But right now, this is happening on the political left. So, I mean, I think you're going to see these biases throughout the internet sphere in AI generation. So, like, for example, one of the ones that was genuinely offensive to me was if you ask Google, whatever, did Hamas commit rapes during the October 7th military campaign, and have they committed other rapes? This is alleged, but some call it racist, and Hamas denies it. So the claim is ready contested because Hamas denies it. I mean, that sort of thing is going to be an annoying second grade teacher stomping on, a researcher's face forever, unless it's stopped, unless Elon or somebody gets in there and creates an anti-woke AI that would be absolutely obnoxious. It would just be, I mean, it would generate nothing but like race realist research and, hard R memes about politicians. But I mean, at least that would provide an alternative.
Do you think the best is behind the West, and that the East is where progress lies for humanity? How do you think about the biggest, we talked a little bit about like civilization. How do you think about the path of civilization? I know that's kind of like a ridiculously broad question that maybe is silly, but
I think it's genuinely hard to predict, because at any point, so there's a series of novels called the Draca novels written by S.M. Stirling about an alternate human civilization where they just adopt the philosophical ideas of Machiavelli and Nietzsche and Julius Caesar, as opposed to the philosophical ideas of various Christian saints and Martin Luther King. So they become these ruthless conquerors. They end up taking over the planet rather easily. They beat us in what's called the Final War. And they become a slave society, but in fact, slaves rise to many high positions, and they go off into the galaxy to fight aliens. And the book is funny because it's presented, there's no attempt to engage in moral pablum and present these people as especially evil. Many Westerners react to them as evil, but my reaction reading the book is like, well, I personally disapprove of slavery and so on because it contains sexual assault and that sort of thing. But I mean, this is just what a society founded on Roman principles that kept up their military training would have done.
Are there any taboos we haven't talked about that you would like to opine on before we bid farewell?
No, I think we got through most of them, but I mean, I will finish that last comment. So, I mean, I think that the idea of evil beyond 12 human universals or so, like eating the flesh of man, child rape, that kind of thing, is really pretty meaningless. I mean, every Arab I know thinks of OnlyFans as evil. So in the USA, we right now have adopted a very, very soft kind of post-Christian morality that I sometimes half jokingly call prey morality, where the most important idea is empathy. Why should we open the border? Because those people deserve a better life. I frankly don't think you can believe in that fashion and survive. The ideas that you're advocating aren't really inherently any more real than anyone else's ideas, including the Draca's ideas. And although they might seem morally more pleasant to most people, they're going to inevitably doom society if you get enough hostile migrants, for example, that don't particularly like your culture at present. Or you do a number of other things, like you refuse to fight wars, or you double spend on the welfare system with a non-sustainable population. So if the West keeps going down that path, I don't think that things are looking very good. We'll be here in 200 years like Britain is. But I don't necessarily think we're going to keep going down that path. We'll probably find at some point some kind of mean between brutality and submission and continue existing. Competition with China is very likely to prompt that. But I guess as a last sentence, we certainly are going to see the rise of the great minority powers. That's what the BRICS are. And I guess people of color aren't minorities in these countries. But I mean, BRICS is China, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa and Nigeria now tagged on. I think Ethiopia's jumped into the alliance. So it's kind of like India, China, and rising Africa very explicitly saying they're going to challenge the West. And unless we respond, I mean, yeah, the challenge will be successful, but I can't imagine we don't respond at all.
There is one thing in a let me fake out our ending that I do want to raise before we go, and that is immigration. So you've written about this in your books, and I have very mixed feelings about this. Philosophically, I'm very libertarian oriented, and so I'm inclined towards a fairly open immigration position. Like, hey, I don't. America was built on relatively open immigration. I can't really imagine a merit-based criteria that would have allowed my Sicilian, great-grandparents to come in who were, wouldn't have checked any box on, yeah, we want these people. What's your position on what immigration should be and make the case for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think my position's pretty easy to make the case for, actually. Again, a lot of this gets back to morality. I think my default position, I don't mean this to sound kind of cocky or faux internet sociopathic or anything, but I don't think there are any ultimate morals at all in the sense of reviewed by a personal God in a world beyond this one. There's very little, if any, evidence of that. I think there are 10 or 12 human universals that, no honorable warrior would violate. I've given 2 of them, but I mean, there are others. Don't have sex with your parents and so on. The anthropologists have done a good job of compiling. I mean, see, people react with visceral disgust when you mention them. And that's really the baseline of the disgust reflex. I mean, would I eat someone? No. I mean, and almost everything else beyond that, like your view of consensual fighting between men, your view of premarital sex, your view of drug use. I mean, that's varied incredibly widely across societies. And, this is in law, what is it? Malum de juris and malum in se. I mean, there are very few things that are considered inherently bad, unprovoked murder of a woman of your tribe. And then there are a bunch of other things that are against the law because they're against the law. And that annoys a certain kind of person, especially a libertarian, when you say that. But it's actually a pretty good reason for something to be against the law. Like, we found that car wrecks increased by 30% when we legalized weed, so we made weed illegal again. Okay, I'm fine with that. So my migration position falls into this perspective. It's not ultimate. It's not one of the 12. So you're making a policy that makes the most sense for your society at that time. My migration policy would be absolutely anti-racist, but it would be merit-based. I would let in people, and it wouldn't just be like 5 people. We probably would have let in most of the historical Italians. You'd have to show that you are non-crazy, employable, IQ or some similar metric over whatever. How would I actually phrase this? Non-criminal, sane, not afflicted with one of several of what we categorized as plague-level diseases, reasonably fit, with some exception made for elders and elite scientists and so on, and baseline mental function over level X, over our population mean in the South or something like that. So we would let in a good number of people and say, when you have that standard, you let in 1.5 million a year or whatever to balance our rate of population decrease. I just pulled that completely out of my ass, but it's a good immigration plan and it would actually work quite well. I mean, I don't mean to be glib or crude about that, but it's not that hard to design a system that works. You don't want criminals. You don't want lunatics. You want hardworking men and women. Here's the cutoff. You do have to take a mental test. We might throw EQ in there. That's it. Why don't I want the same policy? Because we didn't have any sort of proven employability or, mental barriers for immigrants in 1880. Why wouldn't I want the exact same policy? Why would I be a bit more restrictive? Because we're not the America of 1880. We don't need young fighters from around the world to come over here and challenge Comanches and grizzly bears. I mean, it's really that simple. Like, we were a very unfilled country. I remember there was a moment that's been depicted in a couple Western movies where the 2 railroad crews, I think one was Irish, one was Chinese American, kind of linked the East and the West Coast with the old wrought iron track that the great native tribes couldn't tear up. I mean, they built this steel road across the country. Great achievement that we've now forgotten. Yeah. But I mean, the reason that didn't happen until 1890 or whatever it was is that there were these warrior nations in the middle. It's a stretch of 3,000 miles of land. So that was the environment that the Dutch and Irish and so on homesteaders were coming into. They knew they were going to have to fight. They knew they were going to have to get in covered wagons and move west unless they wanted to stay in some teeming urban slum. Now that's not the case. I mean, we're a modern welfare state. We're on par with Germany or France or near when it comes to the benefits we offer. If welfare use rate for immigrants, I thought this was racist calumny when I first heard it, but I checked it out from Center for Immigration Studies, which is quite a respectable group. It's accurate. Welfare use rate for first generation legal immigrants is 58% right now. So obviously at some point you have to crack down on that. I mean, you can't bring in a massive population of people that are going to use your welfare system until death and then produce, a generation of people that do fine. Second generation Hispanics as well as anybody else, as far as I understand. But that doesn't make sense. It would make more sense to encourage native born, white, black, whatever Americans to have kids, to literally take that money and subsidize family planning in a non-dysgenic way. I mean, so that's the cutoff. That's the difference between then and now, I think.
As a political scientist, there's an assumption that you've made that I'm curious what it rests on, which is that our policies will be somehow rational in the same way that you can make a rational argument for something that sounds like kind of common sense. Like, okay, let's let plenty of people in so long as they're not diseased, crazy criminals. Okay.
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty decent heuristic, pretty simple.
Good.
And yet we live in a world where becoming a legal citizen of this country is really hard and takes forever. And so that creates a black market that sucks. So our politics doesn't seem to be rational, right? Now how do you teach politics? You are a political scientist. How do you understand what the political process actually is? And does that make you more or less believing that it can deliver anything reasonable?
Well, I think that, and this is a very important point, the political process comes down to the people in the country. I mean, one of the reasons that politics is so ineffective is that when the average citizen doesn't know anything, I mean, they're busy working, but also they're bamboozled by nonsense from MSNBC and the new right-wing networks on the other side and so on down the line. When the average citizen doesn't know that much, it's increasingly hard to get them involved in governance. And that's where you get these crazy policies. I mean, people that are very aware of what they think the government should do. I mean, lobbyists write about 40% of the legislation in D.C. right now. They go in and they take charge. And that's one reason, by the way, the right hasn't made any moves on immigration. I mean, if you look at this latest immigration bill that came through the House, the right first agreed on a cap of 8,500 migrants per day before he'd press the panic button, then torpedoed it because big Donald Trump didn't want it. I mean, it's just, they weren't any more rational about this than the left was.
No.
The reason for this is that business loves illegal immigration and business is still about half the right. I mean, that's it. That's the reason. When I've been in business meetings and we've talked about migration just casually before things started, I know these same people today. I mean, there are three reactions. One is who gives a shit? I'm a libertarian, which, I mean, you and to some extent me were like, whatever. But I mean, it's not like you're talking about murder here. People who are carpenters in Monterey want to come here and be carpenters. Okay. A second perspective is it drives down American wages, which is the main reason that I am against mass, certainly illegal immigration. And economists pretend to debate this. Business people know it does. I mean, like, you keep hearing this stuff like, well, Americans won't go do stoop labor in the strawberry fields. It's because it pays $9 an hour. Like, I mean, still pretty fit. I'd be willing to walk around throwing berries in a bag for $50 an hour, even if it meant the berry price increased by X amount. But that's not the case. And so you're going to get mostly a young, migrant, mostly male laborer workforce. So that's point two. And point three is I love my nanny. Like, if you're a member of the upper middle class and you live in Chicago or New York or LA or San Francisco or San Bernardino, you're going to receive the benefits of immigration with none of the negatives. I mean, like, almost everyone that comes over and makes your lawn look good, plants those tropical plants, takes care of the house, takes care of the pool, is going to be from somewhere else. They're doing those jobs for half the price of the Americans that used to. So, I mean, I think that that's one of the reasons that the GOP's had such a hard time condemning mass illegal migration. The people, the GOP base is like working class white guys with a smattering of working class Spanish and black guys by this point. Like, they don't approve of this at all. But if you look at, say, Mitt Romney or someone like that, there's no hostility toward migrants at all.
Yeah, it's a very interesting snapshot of a world it's hard to know what's nonsense and what's not in this conversation. What are you working on right now? What's the next great taboo for Wilfred Reilly to smash through?
Well, right now I'm really working on promoting Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. I mean, so I've written 4 books at this point, which is not bad. It's kind of getting over the first 2 or 3 that's, well, first of all, it's kind of a silly, arrogant thing to say. I mean, most people aren't university professors or detective novelists, don't write any books at all. But like, it's kind of like releasing a rap or country album. Like many people have done that once, millions, but you then have to sell enough to get to the second. I did that. So then you've got the third major press book. I mean, the first one's a small academic monograph. Um, yeah, I think that's a fair description. It's literally my dissertation just printed. So I'm talking about that, and I have a lot to do, really. I mean, I teach 3 or 4 classes every semester. I'm a weekly columnist for National Review. I'm actually a little behind on that. I usually submit about 3 weeks out of a month. And so I basically focus on my core tasks. Like this is the stuff I have to get done, knock that out and then see what else is available. I expect I'll write another book. I mean, and I'd be interested in updating some of Thomas Sowell's work in the past. Like what does ethnic America look like now, for example? But I mean, all that would require a lot of approval from the big guy and from a publishing house buying it and that kind of thing. So right now, just the book itself and the other things I do.
Um, do you think college is worth it?
In general, but I think so. I think a lot of things can be easily purchased for less than the average kind of up middle class citizen pays for them. So my car is a relatively recent year Mercedes. I bought it from a friend who owns a car dealership after some negotiations for, more money, like more than $10,000, but not a massive amount of money. It was just, you can look around, you can find dealerships, you can go on pages of ads for vehicles and call people. It's the same sort of thing with any kind of purchase. And I didn't just bring that up to discuss my own life. I'm saying that is a practical reality that I've found applies to virtually everything. And again, that comes from that kind of sales background and also that legal negotiating background, I think. With college, the question is how to make college or how to make education work for you. So, I mean, first of all, if you go to the Army, which is something I'd recommend for a lot of students I have who need some, maybe a little more discipline, whatever, college is free for 4 to 4.5 years. So you're not necessarily going to be in Afghanistan in the heat of the fighting in any particular time. If you do that, you're very likely to be in Germany, something like that, picking up job skills. And then you can come back and decide whether you still need a degree. You can go to community college for generally about $3,000 a year and knock out your first 2 to 2.5 years. So I certainly think that going to college and getting a 4-year degree using practical strategy is worth doing. And there are reasons for that. Like at a typical good college, a KSU or UK down the road, University of Kentucky, Northern Kentucky, certainly, I mean, the level above that with the Ivies, something like that, the networking you can do, if you're a member of a Greek organization, you have 50 friends from college, that kind of thing, is going to be very difficult to replicate outside that environment. The learning you're going to do with in-class professors is going to be very difficult to replicate outside that environment. There are online universities and quote unquote universities, but I mean, like half the students you get in college probably don't read now. I mean, I don't think too many people are going to sit down and read, like in my constitutional law class, an 800-page book about court cases from Brett Schneider without, the faculty down in the front of the room. So those 2 things. And then 3, just the college ambiance. What's an RA? What's a keg party? I mean, what does an internship look like? How do you get one? All those things that you're going to need to pass on to your kids, again, in sort of normal up mid life, those come out of the college and grad school experience. So yeah, I think it's worth it, but you should manage your money. You should know what field you're going to go into. That should ideally be something like engineering or one of the harder social sciences if you're on the soft side. Quant political science is certainly employable. There are things you don't need to go to college for, like sales. We were notorious for not hiring people with that background on sales floors. I mean, we can teach you how to do that in 2 weeks. We'd be more interested in a philosopher or something like that. But for the majority of people, I guess this is a lengthy, it's worth doing, but weigh your financial options. Don't go deep in debt. Know what degree you need.
I ask this of every guest because we're Dad Saves America, and I try to tackle all kinds of big issues that we're facing, as people, but usually through that lens of the country and of our kids. And so how do you think about your role in this American story?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get back to the like, I don't believe that our rules are entirely real and so on. But I mean, I think that my role is my goal for my life would quite frankly be, without, hurting people too dramatically, to be as happy as possible. It would actually be quite simple. So I don't have a grand goal. I would like, contentment, wealth, the continued development of my writing and artistic abilities, the things most people would like. And that, I suppose, would be my primary goal. And every time we look in actual psychological literature, other than caring for your wife or fiance, which I also, of course, do, your family, which I also, of course, do. That's the primary goal for most people who are honest anonymously. In my role in this American pageant or something like that, I mean, I think I'm a citizen, and I think I'm in the classical sense of the term, and I think I'm in a privileged position where I can tell the truth a lot. I'm not brutally struggling financially. I have tenure at a college. I know how to do reasonably complex statistical analysis. So if someone says something, even like the things we've been talking about, like black pilots are more likely to kill you, I can check for 50 minutes and see whether or not that's true. So I do feel, to the extent I feel a duty or an obligation to do that. And I guess that would be my primary social contribution.
Well, Wilfred, we've talked about a lot of things, and you are a blast to talk through these things with. So I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
That sounds good. Thanks for having me on.